Too. She has published most recently At the Limits of Justice, Women of Color on Terror, that came out last year. It's a collection of essays that she has co-edited with Suvendrini Pereira. She's also co-edited a volume of essays called States of Race that came out in 2011 with Melinda Smith and Sunera Tobani. She's also the author of Race and the Eviction of Muslims from Western Law and Politics, Dark Threats and White Nights, the Somalia Affair, Peacekeeping and the New Imperialism, and Race, Space and the Law, Unmapping a White Settler Society, Looking White People in the Eye, Gender, Race and Culture in Courtrooms and Classrooms, Canadian Feminism and the Law, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, and the Pursuit of Equality. Please welcome Sherene Razack.
Thank you, Smaro. Thank you for that introduction. And I did send a panicked email to Smaro saying, you don't really expect me to respond to everybody there today. And she said, no, just respond from who you are. So slight correction there. This conference has really prompted me to ask myself what kind of a problem it is to speak through race. Very few would argue, and I think most of the presenters today would agree with me, that race remains as unspeakable as it was 20 years ago. No one's really talking much about progress. And of course, a more important question to ask is, what does this unspeakability do? The short answer, of course, is that it secures the racial project that is the modern world. And our challenge as writers, artists, teachers, researchers is really to try to understand how race secures the modern world. So when I was asked, by the title of this conference to think about then and now, I really resisted quite a bit going in the direction of some kind of comparison of then and now. Because I think that once you begin to reckon with the fact of racism as unspeakable, with the fact that some are designated as subhuman and are located outside of speech, reason, the law, and humanity, and then and these may be violated with impunity, then you understand that the question of then and now is sort of almost beside the point. I wanted to begin with a very early example of unspeakability to try to get to my reflections on what it means to write through race. So this was an example that I have sometimes spoken about because it stays on my mind, and every time I think about it, something new comes from this example. It was written about quite brilliantly by Sheila Gill in a book I edited called Race, Space and the Law. Race, Space and Citizenship, I think. So in this example, what is interesting about it is that it occurred shortly after the Writing Through Race conference in 1994, when, as you've heard today, cries of apartheid filled the pages of newspapers. But very strangely, they were cries directed at anybody racialized who wanted to talk about racism, rather than at those who kept in place racist structures. So this example is of Oscar Laughlin. In 1995, the Manitoba legislature expelled an Indigenous member of Parliament, Oscar Laughlin, the late Oscar Laughlin, for using the word racist to describe the government's policy responses to his people, the Cree. Responses that included dispossession, a refusal to investigate missing and murdered women. Yes, that was the issue then too. Women such as Helen Betty Osborne. And a continual denial of access to housing and resources. Racism, the Speaker of the House declared, was unparliamentary language. The Speaker advised Mr. Laughlin that Manitoba was a racism-free zone, and that the strong language of the word racism could only be used in Canada when describing apartheid in South Africa. It could not be used to describe the specific actions of individuals or the government of Manitoba, either past or present. As Sheila Gill comments, in one fell swoop, Aboriginal dispossession was rendered out of order and irrelevant. Of course, if Manitoba was a racism-free zone, then Mr. Lathlin's home constituency of Depa, Manitoba, a place where there was a lot of racism, could not be in Manitoba. Gill, who brilliantly analyzes the expulsion of Lathlin from the Manitoba Parliament, elaborates on what she calls the unspeakability of racism. To be expelled from the community of persons, parliamentarians, who are in theory equal, Mr. Lathlin had to be considered as someone who belonged outside of the boundaries of civilized society. His utterance of the word racism in this context had to be characterized by the Premier of the province as discriminatory, inflammatory, and irresponsible, not unlike the reaction to the organizers of the Writing Through Race. In other words, as irrational and thus outside of what could be considered lawful or appropriate in a House of Parliament, Lathlin's very body was expelled. His body, Gill writes, violated the sameness of the House. His body inflamed. It cannot be stressed strongly enough that he had to be evicted if the House was to remain a racism-free zone. He had to be evicted if what is secured by his absence is going to remain secure. Mr. Lathlin simultaneously contaminated and threatened the space when he insisted on talking about Aboriginal poverty and what caused it. When he talked about the murder of Helen Betty Osborne, an Aboriginal schoolgirl killed by 2 white men, when he mentioned the death of J.J. Harper, an Aboriginal leader shot and killed by police, when he mentioned Aboriginal people and the justice system, he did more than disturb the House. He challenged its boundaries, its claims to innocence. Gill writes that making speakable the evidence of colonial racism threatens the liberal subject, not only with being lost, but also with the very loss of a dominant sense of self. Words matter, and if a Cree member of Parliament cannot use the word racism to describe what is happening to his people, the realities of his people cannot be spoken. In effect, his people do not exist, at least not in the declared racist-free zone. The first thing to note from this example is that Mr. Lathlin was legally prevented from speaking. His speech characterized as a savage utterance that did not fall within the boundaries of civilized speech. The second thing to note is the point that interests me the most. Mr. Lathlin was physically thrown out, evicted out of the House of Parliament for his unparliamentary behavior. I would like to reflect for a moment on the spatiality of what was happening here, very much as Gill does. Parliament is constituted as the inside racism-free zone, and Mr. Lathlin's home riding of Depa, Manitoba, was constituted as the outside. And indeed, his body itself was the outside. He was, and this is what I would like to emphasize, the limit point of the human, and thus the limit point of justice and civilization. That is to say, his body marks the beginning of the space of savagery, the space of exception, where law has authorized its own suspension, where there is no right to speak of the realities of his people. When we meet Mr. Lathlin, when we hear his ravings about racism, we will know that we have left the zone of legality, reason, universality. Let me stop for a moment and draw a quick picture for you of what Mr. Lathlin's zone looks like, what the outside looks like. It is a place, the Pa, Manitoba, where Indigenous women can be murdered by white men with impunity. It is a place where a slow genocide has been unfolding for years. It is not in Manitoba, at least not in the part of it where there is the rule of law. I thought of Mr. Lathlin recently, as I think of him quite often, when the Supreme Court ruled that the Government of Canada is within its rights to ban any media interviews of Omar Khadr. Although the judge took note of what he referred to as the unfortunate history of government interference with respect to Mr. Khadr, he agreed that media access to Khadr compromised the security of the prison and other inmates. Apparently, an interview with Khadr would require a lockdown, although it is not clear why. Perhaps if he were to speak, Khadr's words will do the same thing that Mr. Lathlin's words did. They would bring racism into a racism-free zone. Canadians will not have an opportunity anytime soon to hear from his own lips what Omar Khadr, imprisoned as a child at Guantanamo and now in Canada, has to say. We will now have to make do with the government's portrait of him as an unrepentant jihadist. This will remain the story of record. Importantly, Mr. Khadr is banned for what he has yet to say, for what it is anticipated that he will say, an assumption we can make from his body. Both Mr. Lathlin and Mr. Khadr are evicted from law, from speech, and from civilized society, and their eviction secures the inside as the realm of the universal, a place that is untroubled by matters of race. In Mr. Khadr's case, we may speculate that the place to which he has been banished, his outside, is the prison, a place where he has been tortured with the complicity of the Canadian government. We do not need to hear about torture because it will surely disrupt Canadian society, very much as Mr. Lathlin's speech disrupted and threatened. Evictions from law and society constitute the universal. For this reason, we should pay very careful attention when they occur and examine how the law responds to them. For these are the moments that mark the limits of justice. They tell us who is on the inside and who is on the outside. They're very instructive. They vary in form and levels of intensity, but they mark the line between that lovely space of the universal and the spaces where there is authorized violence. Prisons, the Pa, Manitoba, and so on. I want to just mention briefly some recent events as evictions. I want to sort of practice this idea of thinking about them as people getting thrown out of the house of universality and confined to a realm where they are not to enjoy any rights and where violence can be visited upon them with impunity. These events, wearing Muslim woman Rania El Haloul appeared on her own in a Quebec court without counsel and applied for the return of a vehicle seized through Automobile Insurance Board proceedings. In the first few seconds of the matter being called, she was asked by the judge why she wore a scarf on her head, to which she replied it was because she was a Muslim. The judge took a 30-minute break, and when she returned, she told El Haloul that unless she took off her hijab, her case would not be heard. I am very impressed that this was not a hasty act. There was a 30-minute discussion about this. This inside, in this case, is the courtroom. And it is clearly being defined and defended as a place that does not belong to anyone who comes from a zone that we might call outside of civilized society. We will not consider the claims of such people. They are not citizen subjects. They are merely the inhabitants of the outside, against whom we must be vigilant. Their speech, their bodies disrupt and threaten. It is important to elites, to judicial elites, political elites, and media elites, and even to scholarly elites, to help us to identify who belongs inside and who belongs outside. If a judge can throw a woman wearing a hijab out of her courtroom, it then becomes entirely permissible for the rest of us to perform our own evictions. This is how elite racism works. What Madam Justice Marengo has really instructed us in is how to mark the line between inside and outside, how to keep our space racism-free along the lines of Manitoba. The second quick event that I will refer to, I'm also going to use the words of the media outlet. Aboriginal Affairs Minister Bernard Valcourt says some Aboriginal men have a lack of respect towards women on reserves, and that a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women won't accomplish anything. Rejecting calls for an inquiry, Valcourt said Aboriginal communities should work for a solution to violence against Indigenous women. Instead of just talking, he said, if we're honest here, it's apparent what part of the problem is. Valcourt might have easily added that if we're honest here, we know where the problem is. In Valcourt's views, it comes from reserves, the outside. That's where the problem is, and from the people who live there. What is ruled unspeakable here is the violence itself. We don't need to think about the white men who murder Indigenous women, the Robert Pictons of the world, but also the 2 white college students who murdered Pamela George. We don't need to think about what feeds and sustains Indigenous men's violence against Indigenous women. No more Mr. Lathland's pleas, and no more talk about Helen Betty Osborne. Of course, evictions are always followed by authorized, legalized violence, and I think we can expect very soon a lockdown of Indigenous communities on the grounds that they threaten their women and children. This has actually already happened in Australia. I encountered the same response that Mr. Valcourt and his government had to the deaths of Indigenous women when I explored and examined the deaths of Indigenous men in custody. Indigenous men, as do black men, die at an alarming rate in custody. In the cases of Indigenous death, this runs the gamut from being struck by a police cruiser, from being pepper sprayed, from being restrained, to shooting, and the penultimate freezing deaths. Unless we believe that Indigenous men are somehow mysteriously always on the brink of death and dying from their own pathologies, we are obliged to consider what this amount of death, its numbers, the circumstances, what they tell us about the overall response of settler society towards Indigenous people. There is a level of dehumanization here that is visible in all the encounters that are painstakingly gone over in inquests and inquiries, all of which conclude that these moments of inhumanity, moments when a person's life is deemed to be worthless, are really only moments of cultural insensitivity. Or, at best, they are moments when someone forgot to remove the hanging points from the prison cell, to check on a really seriously ill prisoner, and so on. When you look at this kind of death, you realize that settler societies have a very profound investment in narrating Indigenous death as a story of disappearing Indians. The process of making a people disappear is not simply one of elimination. It is rather a process that involves marking materially and symbolically the Indigenous body as one that is somehow not up to the challenge of living modern life. To talk about these deaths and about the narratives that turn these deaths into indigenous dysfunction, I find myself in Mr. Lathland's predicament. I will shortly be ruled out of order. You will note that the silencing that is visible in these cases is intensely productive. If we don't talk about it, if we call it dysfunction instead of murder, then what is secured? And that is the question that I'm urging you to think about from these evictions. One final eviction that was mentioned already today is the anti-terror bill, and I won't go into that. But what that bill, which will give unprecedented powers to CSIS, really emphasizes is that now there is an apparatus that is going to be legally entrenched, even more than it already is, that will be entirely dedicated to evictions. You will find yourself outside the law, detained indefinitely, without the right to be to habeas corpus, to know of what you're charged. What is important about this, and you will of course remember Arar, sent off to be tortured in a Syrian prison on shared and inaccurate information between the RCMP and the Americans. What is important about this is that the mark that gets you evicted from law or from humanity is a roving one. It moves. While race is a reliable predictor, it is not the exclusive one. Any one of us may be evicted in the name of national security, and now there will be this magnificent apparatus to do it. As writers, any one of us may be deemed offensive, our words declared, as Oscar Lathland's words were declared, discriminatory, inflammatory, and irresponsible. At this point, it will come with indefinite detention. When we cannot write or speak of race, we too are being evicted from that warm, well, at least metaphorically warm place that we call the nicest place on earth, where white civility, rationality, and rights reign. We are being banished to the realm of the Lathlands and the Kaders, places where there is torture, missing and murdered indigenous women, and much more. Our eviction serves to mark the place that is the limit, the place that my friend Denise da Silva calls the horizon of death. What might it mean to know from the place of Oscar Lathland, to know from the horizon of death? What might it mean to name contemporary violence, bearing in mind the evictions on which the space of universality depends? So I want to end by thinking about what it means to write and to speak and to know at the limits of justice. For me, the first thing about contemporary terror and violence is that there is a lot of it. The second thing to note is that the bodies to whom it is attached are all racialized. Some of them may look white to you if you're going strictly on phenotype. Think here of the green-eyed Afghans, but they're all going to be understood as a different kind of human. A human who is not advanced or evolved and who has to be assisted out of his or her primitive state. Of course, some of these subhumans refuse assistance and are at best ungrateful, at worst anti-modern. The third thing to note is that the place, the actual geographies and the bodies of those who are in this zone of non-legality, this place outside the law, is a place where violence dwells and where it is required, especially when populations refuse to be improved or assisted. What is really significant about these spaces of inside and outside is that those of us who are relegated to the outside are not merely being discriminated against. Our elimination is required to keep the inside as it is. Many scholars, among them my friend Denise da Silva, stresses that the Enlightenment idea of man as a self-determined subject, as rational and emerging from a state of nature, requires for self-definition a constitutive outside, a subject who cannot progress out of nature. Oscar Laughlin was declared to be that kind of human, who is not fully rational, not fully emerged from a state of nature. The racial marks a different kind of human. The racial also explains away violent deaths. They die because they cannot cope with modern life. They die because they have endangered us all. We can't begin to understand and end violence without confronting the logic that installs different kinds of humans on a scale of development, and that demands the obliteration of the other as the condition enabling the self-determining subject. In her book, The Global Idea of Race, Silva asked this question: how are modern subjects produced who can be excluded from the universal without unleashing an ethical crisis? I am much taken with that phrase, without unleashing an ethical crisis. No one will care, no one will deem it wrong if Mr. Laughlin is evicted from the house, if Indigenous women die, if Muslims are tortured. It bears emphasizing Silva's point that to be excluded from the universal is to be placed at a social and moral distance from the European. Violence can be directed with impunity at those outside of the domain of justice. What then is our political agenda, given that the racial, the mark of a different kind of human, is a modern political strategy? As Silva advises, we should not be focusing on exclusion and its answer, inclusion. Instead, we should focus on how the racial actually constitutes modern life. Taking on Cornel West, she writes, "Black exclusion from humanity is not the problem per se. The problem is how whites come to signify humanity in the first place." Anti-Blackness scholars, and Ronaldo has illustrated that today, have shown quite clearly that anti-Blackness is a logic that operates on the principle that Black bodies can be owned, are disposable, and exist outside the realm of the human. It is a principle, Jared Sexton writes, that is prior to everything. So to think through evictions, we will have to think through anti-Blackness. As Ronaldo puts it himself in one of his articles, what it means to be human is continually defined against Black people and Blackness. In the same way, what it means to be human is continually defined against Oscar Laughlin and Indigenous life. So we may gasp and feel afraid today when we hear of things like anti-terror bills and secret prisons where torture is practiced and Black men shot by police where no one is called to account. It is going to be impossible for us to shrug and say, there is nothing new under the sun. Those of us who are terrorized cannot afford such indifference. But newness really is beside the point. What the point is that the racial logic that remains at the core of this violence, the logic of humanity and subhumanity, is what endures. That's how these categories are maintained, and we have to think about that in our political strategy. We can expect that those who speak from the limit point, those whose bodies are in fact the limit, will be evicted, will be silenced, will be blamed for their own demise. It was not an extraordinary thing that happened to Oscar Laughlin, but it was no less a practice of terror than is any of the other things we have mentioned today. Each type of eviction installs a hierarchy of humans, a hierarchy that violence keeps in place. What remains pressing for me is how we foster the moral communities for whom the multiple sources of violence and terror and these multiple evictions are unacceptable. It is imperative to consider the discursive and representational means through which violence and terror gain social approval. How do we come to believe in the fiction of inside the house and outside the house? What silences us? Very few Canadian commentators in the media could even name Judge Marengo's actions as racist. The word, it seems, is still relatively taboo. We racialized writers and scholars need critical reflection on our own difficulties and complicities in researching and writing about violence and terror. And that was also mentioned by Ronaldo. How do we write and speak when our own bodies are conflated with the violence? How do we write and speak when our bodies are also differently configured so that some are targeted for lesser violence and others for more? As we collectively insist in our scholarship that the dehumanization of our communities must end, we need to grapple with the many layers of our implications. I'll sum up by saying that what has happened today has demonstrated even more that we must all be as dedicated to being as unparliamentary as possible. Joining the Oscar Lathlins of the world in their refusal to stay within the boundaries of what passes for civilized speech. We should be very suspicious of places that are declared racism-free and moments when we are accused of inventing racism. That was the message 20 years ago, and it's the message today. Thank you.
To say that for you younger folk, there's a torch here to be picked up. And we're going to be behind you. I'm 65 years old. I have grandchildren. In fact, I have a great-grandchild. Someone with more vigor, someone who's a little more agile. It's time for you to get up and to be heard. And we're going to stand there behind you. Okay?
Thank you, Sherene. That was amazing. I just feel like I've learned so much from your talk and from the rest of today. When you were talking about the anti-terrorism bill, I'm from Singapore, and it occurred to me that in Singapore we have the same, we've always had it, it's not new, same internal security department bill that allows people to be detained without trial. And the longest anyone's been detained without trial is 40 years. So, to me, I made that connection because it is a colonial legacy based on emergency measures taken during the communist uprising in Southeast Asia. I wonder, though, as you ended your talk and you talked about being unparliamentarian, which is greatly inspiring, whether that moment of thinking about the limits and evictions is a moment that maybe we can productively and critically think about thinking beyond the nation then. And also thinking, and just speaking from my own perspective, thinking in ways that transcend those borders and thinking of coalitions that would be in other countries as well, fighting the same kinds of battles against similar legislation that has this long, long imperial history.
I totally agree with you. Is this on? I totally agree with you that those are moments to think beyond the nation space and also to think more broadly, and I'll give you the example of dispossession, to think more broadly of what that means, because we think of dispossession in this settler colonial society as indigenous peoples having had their land stolen. But we could also think of dispossession in multiple ways. People whose bodies are stolen, during slavery. We can stretch our analysis to see how these evictions actually connect. And that, I think, will give us some of our strategies. And it is, I think, though, very, very important to be quite specific about how these evictions work so that they're not all collapsed into the same thing.
Creative writing pedagogy and mentorship. I'm in the creative writing program at U of T, and creative writing programs in general, across North America in particular, remain very ethnically homogenous. They remain very white, quite frankly. And I'm just wondering, because that same structure is then represented in the publishing industry, how are we supposed to nurture and cultivate new minority voices in a space like that? I mean, if we're taking the Writing Through Race conference as a model, are we supposed to be then trying to create exclusively POC workshops and programs? How else? Or do we need to be working through the system? I mean, specifically, I'm thinking at the post-secondary level, so at the doctoral level, at the graduate level. So this is a question really for everybody.
I think Roy Mickey, you said something really important, I think, today, which is what was the pedagogy behind this idea that racialized people of color, indigenous people, black people should meet and figure out what was happening and figure out their strategies. That is a radical pedagogy, and wow, it's going to be followed by eviction, right? Because that's what happened here. The money got cut. I should mention an example I've been dying to mention all day, which is when researchers and academics of color decided to organize. We had our national conference in 2002. First of all, there was not a drop of money to be had anywhere to have it. And when we finally had it and had 80 scholars of color presenting, the strategy that we faced after that was years of persecution on the grounds that we had criticized Israel. So I know it was connected to a political issue. But the fact that it was 80 scholars of color who met in a conference and only scholars of color could speak at that conference was enough to cause us grief. Certainly for me, I still get threats on my email and letters to my dean whenever I speak. So I think that my answer to you is maybe we have to still think of these radical pedagogies, but it sure isn't going to be easy to think about that. And in everything we do have to ask ourselves, how is our strategy complicit with the institution? And how does it undermine it? Because many, it's really hard to tell. I really find, if I reflect on my 20-something years as an academic, many times I've been wrong.
I'm just to have continue to have great support, but it made me think of something that happened when I was in university in my undergrad. And I was in theater and I wanted to be an actor at that time. And I went to hear Janet Sears speak, and she was talking about her play Harlem Duet. And it was the first story where I really felt, because it was about America and African Americans and my family's American, I really felt connected to it. And I remember I was very facetious, I don't know, very young in my thinking, and I went down to her and I said, I loved your play, how can I find more monologues that tell our story? And she said, write your own. And I was like, I'm not a writer at that time. I was like, I'm not a writer, I'm an actor. And she said, why would you want to be being told what to do by others instead of creating your own space to exist and perform and for others? And anyways, I guess the moral of the story is we have to do the work ourselves to create the space for those who are coming after us. And it's, one of those burdens, quote unquote, that we carry, but it's also a great blessing, because in those opportunities we see change. I'm mentoring a grade 9 girl who's writing her first novel, and I said, wow, Imagine if I had had that opportunity when I was in grade 9. And so I just say, there's not an easy answer, because we are the people that will make that change, and that will be professors, and we all have to choose which avenue that is, whether it's through the universities or through the writing community or through the teaching in the high school community. But we who carry that burden will be the people that fix it.
Canada is considered a kind of mosaic as opposed to a melting pot like the States is. I feel like with the introduction of the anti-terror law and everything recently that that there's already been a tile, like a place in the mosaic that's been carved out for younger writers, and that we have to conform to that piece. Otherwise, we're going to be constantly evicted and marginalized. And I'm wondering, how do you suggest younger writers strategize to get past that? How do we get out of the marginalized zone without having to worry about eviction with newer laws that seem to regress society?
I think I was trying to say that there will always be the eviction and that it will be really violent. So I guess the only answer that I would have to that is try not to do it alone. Like, try to be organized, because that's going to be the only way out. I think that if you can't even say the word racism, what can you do? And today, Canada is a country where you cannot say the word racism. I mean, I served as an expert witness at the Air India inquiry, and the government lawyer asked me if I was really serious that colonialism had happened. Did I really think that that had happened? We weren't even debating ongoing. We were debating that it had happened in a court of law. You know, so to think for a second that there's any way, I guess what I was trying to say is maybe inclusion is not what we want.
Laughlin, and of course Wikipedia doesn't have that story at all, right?
Oh.
I mean, it has him, but it doesn't tell the story
that
that
is
you just
done.
told us. And I sort of didn't expect it to, but I still sort of hoped, and it made me think of the recent banning of a few female Wikipedia writers they're banned from writing about gender issues in the wake of Gamergate, right? Because there's a hierarchy of Wikipedia editors. So my comment is simply like we as creative writers, I guess if we thought of imaginative writing, creative writing, as in conversation with history, a more legitimized form of story writing, if our fiction was in conversation with like legitimate history. I feel like now we're very much in conversation with these globalized information platforms. Like Wikipedia is like encyclopedia/history. It's this monolithic document that does have these same gendered and raced politics around what gets left up as the official document. And so to see that Wikipedia is not going to represent Oscar Laughlin the way that you do, it fuels me to put at least a document, to make my creative work a document of the history of the and the experiences that I live.
Yeah, I'd just like to expand on what Sherene was talking about, and thank you very much for building up this critical model that helps us understand the way in which liberal democracies, through the practice and discourse of law, constitute an inner and out, inside and outside. But we could diffuse that a little bit and apply it to our more benign institutions, like the study of Canadian literature, for instance, or all the multiple disciplines within universities that produce the same kind of frameworks of eviction, but in much more benign ways. So writers may come up against this in the publishing world, going to a publisher and having a story of a particular historical event and stuff like that, and the editor saying, oh, you can't deal with that particular moment, you must deal with it in this way. And the writer changes and revises representation. So there's these subtle barriers and borders and zones that get created that certain representations get evicted. And I just wanted to point out that we should be able to apply your model to cultural representations and other forms of representation that are more benign in certain ways, but also enact particular modes of violence, right, on particular people and groups.
I mean,
I just wondered if you wanted to comment on. I was not my question.
Yeah, I wanted to comment only on your more benign, because I think when certain stories are suppressed, which is what you're talking about, stories are suppressed or representations are suppressed, I don't see that as somehow more benign than getting shot or getting thrown out of the house. I actually see them as the same practice, which is to be very violent towards certain bodies. A story is never just a story. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so invested in getting us to shut up about racism. I mean, that parliament thought that there was a lot at stake. They didn't want Oscar Laughlin to speak. And I think there is a lot at stake, and they know it. So we should know it too.
The way in which we use language can allow us to imagine our present differently, but also to think about what is necessary now to produce a different kind of politics in the future. So I was in this historical moment, especially within the context of the Canadian nation state. Everybody, we notice the project of settler colonialism. But I wonder what happens when we put settler colonialism alongside slaveocracy. I wonder what happens when we reject the language and the logic of the immigrant. I wonder what happens when we stop calling ourselves minorities. I wonder what happens when we notice that the language of diversity is not a useful language to think about multiple forms of difference in the world. I wonder what that does to our imagination. I wonder what it does to how then we think we can live together. Because I think that the ways in which at this particular historical moment we're thinking these things, even as we articulate them in some of our most radical forms, what seems to lie in its wake is the legitimacy of the state that comes out of settler colonialism and slaveocracy. And if the state that comes out of settler colonialism and slaveocracy is already a genocidal state, how can we reform it to do anything other? So for me, that's become the fundamental question of my work.
Follow up on a couple of your observations. One about evictions. And I'm not a writer, a creative writer. I'm a lawyer, a law professor. But it strikes me so strongly that what you're talking about when you talk about evictions is putting people outside of the rule of law. And in legal history, from medieval times, if you were put outside the rule of law, you were made an outlaw, your property was confiscated, but more importantly, anyone who saw you could kill you. And so you were without the protection of the law. And in my own work, I have looked at the many ways in which Indigenous women have been put outside the rule of law in this country as a way of explaining why they have been the subjects of such continuing violence. This has been deliberately done by acts of the state, which brings me to my second observation, and that is when you talk about settler people have a profound investment in the idea or the story of disappearing Indians. Yes, they do, and the investment is colonialism, because if you are trying to take land that's occupied by certain people, the only way you can get that land is to get them off it. And assimilation was tried, but also a very overt strategy of the Canadian state has been to make Indigenous peoples disappear by killing them. And so when you're talking somewhat metaphorically, but I think there's a really brutal reality at the heart of what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I'm actually not talking metaphorically at all, because actually a book of mine is about to come out on the numbers of Indigenous men who have been murdered and women in custody. So I'm not being metaphoric at all about it. I really wanted to say that you first get booted out of the human, and that enables you to be booted out of law, and that enables anyone to kill you with impunity. And so thank you for reminding us that that is the sequence of events. But it does begin with getting booted out of the category of the human.
Interesting to remember that if the first step to that train of thought that you just led us down is to be excluded from the sort of category of human, there's also a historical colonial process through which we were first incorporated into the realm of human, at least in that kind of modernist European discourse. That was the whole process of colonialism. That was the liberal, not neoliberal, but the liberal transformation of the colonial project historically was all about how, you know, this isn't really a bad project, this is about civilizing. This is about creating humans out of subhumans. So now that they've created us and made us into humans, they can now kick us back out of humans, which is why I actually think what the gentleman over here said about the discovering a new vocabulary and letting go to some degree of the idea of minority, it's actually quite encouraging because we're not at all really minorities. It's like 3/4 of the world. So anyway, I just wanted to follow up with that the historical aspect of it actually ties this all together really well.
You know, all colonial projects announce themselves as projects of improvement. They set out to improve subhumans, but I don't think we ever make it in.